Welcome to the Eye of the Needle podcast, where we discuss healthcare innovation and explore how visionary entrepreneurs and change leaders are reshaping the future of our industry.
Most healthcare organizations weren't built to innovate. They were built to operate. Rigid organization charts, compliance-driven cultures, and risk-averse clinical decision-making processes. It's often easier to say no than try something new. Even with the best intentions, healthcare companies get stuck in endless pilots, internal politics, and death by committee. In this episode of the Eye of the Needle podcast, I'm joined by Lesa Mitchell, General Manager of Alloy Partners, to explore a powerful model for innovation. Alloy combines an innovation laboratory concept and a venture studio concept. And basically what that means is the innovation lab part generates new ideas and prototypes, and the venture studio goes a step further to build and launch real companies with dedicated teams and funding. When you combine these two approaches and partner with a healthcare enterprise, you get an agile structure for innovation that helps scale transformative solutions. Today, we're going to learn more about how Alloy helps organizations move from inertia to impact, and what it takes to build a company in partnership with a legacy system, and why this moment right now is healthcare's chance to think bigger, act bolder, and finally commit to innovation. So welcome, Lesa. Could you give us a brief intro about your background and a little bit more about your role at Alloy?
Okay, great. Thanks for having me, Pam. Really appreciate it. My background started in a rocket ship that was a pharmaceutical company that had just gone public. And I was lucky to have a mentor that was the global head of R&D and sail through a whole bunch of mergers and acquisitions that ended up being a company that we all know now is called Sanofi. Took the opportunity then to become an entrepreneur and sell back into pharma, which is a great thing to do when you come out of an organization. And many great entrepreneurs are creating a problem that they couldn't solve within a company and go out and solve it elsewhere. And then through my role at a large private foundation that was endowed by the gentleman who started the first company, I had the opportunity to explore innovation, entrepreneurship, starting new companies, investing in new companies, et cetera, and have spent the rest of my career doing just that. I joined Alloy Partners 3 years ago. I had met Scott Dorsey, the founder of High Alpha Innovation, 4 or 5 years before that. We interviewed each other at one of Steve Case's events, which is how we met. And he told me they were spinning out of High Alpha proper a new co that is now called Alloy Partners that was focused on not just a venture studio that was inventing companies from scratch, but actually leaning into Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma and partnering with corporations to identify what problems are and how they would spin out. And came into Alloy Partners working for Elliot, our CEO and founder, where I lead the venture building work at Alloy Partners, which does everything from working with those corporations in the first place to understand what their problems are and how we could potentially create a new code together to solve them. And then ultimately on the other side, our internal team that also works for me is focused on hiring those founding team members and scaling the companies.
Interesting. Well, so you work across multiple industries at Alloy, correct?
Correct. Yes.
What are some of those? Just share with our audience. Where all you help innovate?
Yeah. And ultimately, I've always said in my life, I try to run away from healthcare and I get sucked back in.
Don't we all?
So, so when I first joined Alloy, we were working across multiple industries. Our very first company that we launched was with Koch Industries,
Mm,
well-known large company that we launched a couple of companies through that are scaling and just closing their A rounds right now, to Elanco, where we've launched a couple of companies in the both animal and feed additive space, and then started moving into healthcare and
mm,
have moved into and on the way also worked with launched a company with CMS, which is North Star Energy,
mm.
and launched a company focused on renewables and biomass. And from there have worked with pharma companies, large healthcare systems, a large payer. In some cases, I can name them, and in some cases, I can't because of where we are in our progress.
Sure.
Usually, until we launch a company, they're not to be named. But yes, we've worked across industries and find lots of commonalities across industries that I think most people in healthcare see themselves as very unique and different from those other businesses, but in many cases they're not. Many are highly regulated as well. Have also worked with big banks.
So my guess is the common patterns is when they're a large enterprise, they're kind of bureaucratic and kind of stuck in their in the way they've traditionally worked. So those patterns across those industries are probably fairly common in that you guys know how to help those big companies do
Yeah.
things differently and innovate. Is that fair?
Oh, that's absolutely fair. And I would tell you, what's unique about Alloy Partners is Elliot Parker, our founder, who was a former partner at High Alpha, also worked for Clayton Christensen
Right.
in his life. And Elliot would say we are actually a spin out company ourselves based upon Innovator's Dilemma.
Interesting. So, for our audience members who may not be familiar with Clayton and his work and that book, can you tell them a little bit more about kind of his premise and kind of
Yeah.
what he put out there?
Yeah. I mean, the premise of Innovator's Dilemma is using some of the words that you used when you kicked off this podcast, is that large corporations are essentially built for focusing on capital efficiency. They're building for scale, they're building for repeatability. And in those boardrooms, there's mostly talk about those kinds of topics and launching similar products that they've already launched before, and very little time focused on disruption. And in many cases, much of Clayton's research focused on the fact that big corporations can't innovate. And they can't innovate because it's essentially rejecting a new organ, which is disruption coming in, as all of
Right.
our healthcare people would understand organ rejection.
Right.
um,
Right.
and so, therefore, in many cases, it's impossible to do from the inside, which is why, at the end of the day, creating a new co is the workaround. And the large corporation becoming a customer of the new co is much easier than trying to build a new model inside of a corporation. And the change management that's required to do that turns into politics
Yes.
and rejects that new organ.
Well, and it's interesting. I've had large health system clients that they've had a separate innovation division, but they can't even get their own health system to be customers of the innovation division. They sell it elsewhere. So it's
Correct.
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. The other thing that I would like to mention that Clayton focused on is, different kinds of innovations, and
Mhm.
innovations that are transformational to your core, and then innovations that are focused on your core. And I think what's interesting is we find that companies that we've started fall into both of those categories. Some of them, the problems that we're trying to address with the big co are actually super disruptive to their business.
Right.
I would put them in that transformational category.
Sure.
and are very much tied to strategic intent being different. And with the, onslaught of AI in our world, kind of like the early web days,
Right.
much of the AI innovation is focused on core and completely changing internal processes,
Right.
internal how we're allocating resources, et cetera, is very much attached to the core. And so we see ourselves playing in both places.
Well, and I know for sure that AI is targeting things that we have thrown bodies and labor at for 30 years and not been able to solve the
Yes.
problem. But AI
Yes.
can take it to a whole new level, and that's very exciting.
Yep.
So tell me, when you guys work with a healthcare organization and you kind of help them understand how you can help them do the things you just talked about, kind of what is different about healthcare? Or I mean, what are you finding as you partner with large healthcare enterprises that may be a little bit different, or maybe it is more similar to other industries than they realize? But what is
It really is more
healthcare?
similar.
Okay.
Yeah, it really is more similar.
Okay.
I mean, each company, each type of company has their own, like pharma is completely different from a hospital,
Sure.
is completely different from a payer. But if you look inside of all pharma, they're very similar. If you look
Mm-hmm.
inside all hospitals, they're very similar. And all
Mm-hmm.
payers, they're very similar. The difference, frankly, is how aggressive leadership is relative to wanting to radically accelerate change,
Mm-hmm.
what their appetite is. I also find what's fascinating, and you know this, is that any kind of company is impacted by malfeasance. And the example in healthcare is, the more cybersecurity attacks a healthcare system has, the more they've changed internal policies and practices to address malfeasance, which makes them more or less willing to change.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's very similar in all highly regulated industries.
That makes sense.
Malfeasance that occurs impacts almost their strategy and practices.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you see it similar between banking, frankly, and hospitals, to
Mhm.
give a good example.
Right, right, right.
Yeah, but they are actually very similar. I mean, in all cases, we're going in and we're wanting to understand strategic intent, no matter what the kind of hospital system, where they see their gaps, helping map those gaps toward strategic intent and change that they want to make. We have some hospital systems that we work with that want to have greater magnet designation relative to their nursing staff, which definitely impacts the kinds of things that they want to work on.
Mhm.
Different than some hospitals that want to push more of their systems outside of the hospital system, meaning, I want to focus on where my return on investment is, and that is actually the NICU, the ICU, and the ER. And so I want to know, how do I move toward that? And maybe how do I move outside of my system, some of those
Mhm.
other things that are currently within the system. But that's not dissimilar than, the kinds of strategic and gap analysis discussions we have at the very beginning with any company.
Right, right. Well, that makes sense. And do you guys typically work with an organization that has tried innovation before and failed, or they're already innovating and just want to do it faster, quicker? Or do you work with organizations that are completely new and never done anything before and want to put their toe in the water? Or is it all of the above?
Yeah, it is all of the above, but I would tell you that it tends to be people who are already, as you know, companies change over the years in terms of, 20 years ago, it was I have a quality improvement team. to
Right.
now it is, I have an innovation team.
Interesting.
And now the innovation team sometimes are moving straight into corporate venture capital team or distributed across a company. But usually what we find is that the senior leadership within, at the board level and the senior level have been talking about addressing certain problems that they want to address, whether those are ROI questions or regulatory compliance, or as I said, we want to have a magnet designation, we want to have a cancer center designation, others. And if they have already had those questions, it's much easier for us to then jump right into strategy gap analysis and highlight some areas that we might want to work on together.
Oh, that makes sense. And I know probably some of our audience maybe they've heard a number of these innovation partners. They've heard about incubators or accelerators, or even, your model, which is a little bit of a hybrid of several things. How do you differentiate your model, Alloy's model, versus some that they may have heard before, like a venture investment or a incubator? I mean, what
Yeah.
are the differences?
Yeah. And I didn't say in the introduction of myself that I also used to be a general manager of Techstars,
Yes.
which obviously is Techstars and Y Combinator are the two largest and long-term and successful accelerators in the world.
Right.
And I think that the way to think about the difference in the models are, one, many hospital systems, as an example, have a corporate venture capital arm.
Right.
And what happened, just like in many other big companies, and what happens in that corporate venture capital arm is either they are given the direction to go out and find investments of companies that are already alive and kicking, usually not at seed stage, but more at scale stage.
Right.
Invest in them with an intention that we will also be a customer. Sometimes they're given given the roadmap to simply go out and invest in really cool companies, some of which we may implement, some of which we may not. But usually it is not at seed stage. Usually it as, and this is the trick. Because even if you have a corporate venture arm and you have experience in investing, you probably weren't doing it at I'm a baby company. You were doing it as this thing was already has many other hospital systems as customers. We're now investing and we want to onboard them, but you're onboarding that new co when all the bells and whistles, have been worked out and the bugs worked out, which is a completely different stage. When you are working with an accelerator, and incubators were words that were around in healthcare probably back in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Right.
And frankly, there was a lot of incubators back then, mostly in the drug and device space, that no longer really exist anymore. Not because they weren't successful, because many of them were successful, but it was so hard that the teams just got worn out. To be honest, I know many of them. But in the accelerator model is completely different. You as an accelerator, you're just looking for cool companies. 5 years ago, Techstars was also doing accelerators with large companies. One of them was a hospital system. Our first one, I think, was with Cedars-Sinai. And in that case, again, we were kind of co-thinking together about what kind of companies that they were interested in. And then the Techstars team would go out and find them and bring them in. And the accelerator model is intentionally focused on founding teams and helping them grow fast. But it isn't necessarily focused on, here is the strategy of my company and the gaps. And frankly, I'm probably not going to find a company out there that's going to address exactly what I need. I'm going to find things that are close and maybe close. But the venture building model that we have is custom built. I mean, this is custom building. You are addressing the gaps in the business. You're defining exactly how you need that company to operate. And then, when we do that together, we decide how much money we're going to invest in the company. We decide together what we want the CEO and founding team to look like, that we are going to do a pilot with them. That is 100% of the time. We're looking to co-create an advantaged company. That is our, we believe that down to the core, is that we're not going to create a company that doesn't have advantage. An advantage is, I have an investment already walking in the door, and I have a customer walking in the door. And so, as you could imagine, I can go out and recruit a much different CEO if I have that kind of advantage than if I'm starting with a blank piece of paper and just say, gee, CEOs, come and help me.
Well, and I think that is one of your really big differentiators, is that you decide what the company should be and kind of what you want it to accomplish. And then you go find that executive who is experienced most often. They've been down this road before, and you're a matchmaker. You match that company with that executive, that CEO, as opposed to the guy that starts a company in his garage and goes to a VC and goes, invest in me when I, hit a certain amount of revenue. You guys kind of launch it with that leader in place, which I really think makes a difference.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. A company that I can talk about, and the system that we launched it with. We've worked with Catalyst and Wellstar
Here in
system down in Atlanta, in your backyard.
Yes.
And launched 2 different companies with them. First one is called VFlock. The product is called Swift. John Sheehan, maybe, I'm not remembering, but I think this is probably his 4th company.
Yes, I know he's very experienced, right?
Very experienced, been in healthcare. And so, as we're going down the road of when we were launching these companies and launching these pilots together, we're figuring out what the KPIs are, what the integrations need to be, much of which we've talked about way before we ever launched the company, so that there's no surprises. But John is getting into the details of that system. And what happens with our founders when you're launching as a baby company, not a bigger experienced company, is he's hitting all sorts of walls internally.
Right.
Whether it be, how do I integrate with Snowflake? How do I integrate with this as a baby company that can't get $20 billion of cybersecurity insurance? But at the same time, myself and someone from Catalyst is on his board. I mean, we are blocking and tackling together those roadblocks internally to try to help John move forward. And so that is the beauty of doing it in partnership with a corporation, is if we weren't both at the table with him, he would be on his own and hitting these walls within the corporation that probably would slow him down to the extent that he couldn't even implement.
Well, and I can say, because I do know this company, is that he is working on a problem that health systems have had for years. I, in fact, as a baby consultant 100 years ago for Ernst & Young, worked on that very issue, and we still haven't solved it. And it's about nurse staffing and workforce, but AI is part of that equation, just like we talked about earlier. It's something we couldn't do it as individual people trying to solve problems, but AI can scale and do things much quicker and in ways that we can't even hope to do it. So you mentioned Catalyst by Wellstar. Are there any other healthcare innovation partners that you're at liberty to speak of, just to show some of the logos of who you guys are working with?
Yeah. I mean, we've worked with IU Health. We've worked with, there's one that we're working with right now that we can't name yet, but we have multiple. We've worked with UNC Health System in North Carolina. And so there are multiple companies that we've worked with to create a company, and multiples that are customers now of the companies that we have created, but we have so many current opportunities kind of in the hopper that we are working on companies right now that you'll see next year.
Oh, great. Well, that's very exciting. So I want to talk a little bit about how a lot of my customers historically have thought about change. And I'm going to, for a moment, lump innovation and transformation under just the broad category of change.
Yep.
But they've invested heavily in things like EHRs and ERPs and CRMs and every other big system of record known to man. And that does drive a lot of change, a lot of investment dollars. But in their mind, often they think, well, we'll just continue to pour the money into these large enterprise systems. What you're seeing these companies these baby companies that you're helping launch and scale, what is different about them than these traditional large enterprise systems like EHRs and ERPs?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you've just named the biggest difficulty in hospital system.
Yes.
Relative to EHRs. But I think the changes that we have seen in the last year are the ability to simply do API calls versus necessarily build a new, there's no room left in the EHR for us to continue to add things to the EHR. And so I think what we've seen with both APIs and AI technology is the ability to pull information out of versus push information into. That is the biggest change. But you're right. I mean, clearly we've worked with OSF hospital system in Illinois. And we originally created a company together that was intended to be tied to their hospital system. And along the way, realized in the first 6 months that this was not the right angle to go. We actually had to be selling to payers versus selling to the hospital system. They have been unbelievably supportive in that being not only the right answer for the patients, but it actually addressing a problem that they have in their hospital, because many of the patients that we're focused on in that case, we're trying to keep them out of the hospital.
Right. It all depends on where the incentives are coming from, for sure.
Well, and you've named it. It is all tied to the incentives.
Right.
And so the ability to either work around or work alternatively through the ERPs and the EHRs that are already in place is what has to happen. I have to tell you, I think, one of the most interesting things that everyone who's worried about these big enterprises should note is that Salesforce just spent, and I don't quote me on the number, but maybe $8 billion acquiring a huge data company because Salesforce knows they need to be reinvented themselves and turned into an AI company. And Salesforce is the ultimate, essentially same thing as EHRs.
Yes, it's that enterprise CRM for sure. And that's what we're hearing more and more. The future is not going to be about those individual systems like EHRs and ERPs or even point solutions. It's going to be around the data and having a big data asset that there's this whole ecosystem that surrounds, some within the enterprise, some outside the enterprise, but being able to move that data around, that's going to be the future for sure. And
and as you know, many companies, and again, whether you're pharma, whether you're a payer, or whether you're a hospital system, knowing where your data lie is actually the hard part.
And it's a secret sauce for sure.
And it's much of what we do when we get into the system.
Yes.
Is we have to figure out where the data lie, where we can integrate the data in order to create a new company that's going to be able to link to that. So it is kind of the secret sauce.
And one other analogy I've kind of tried to explain to some of my healthcare business leaders that maybe don't truly understand the data or technology strategy is that, for the last 20 plus years, we've been building these large enterprise systems, but people always have been the glue between system A and system B and system C. And so now what we're trying to do is not have people doing all of this, being the glue between these systems, using AI driven tools and other data technologies to help pull them all together, as opposed to it being, the team sitting around the corner that's moving data from one system to the next. And it's a little simplistic, but I think it helps those guys understand the difference.
And I could give you a great example. We have a company that we spun out with UNC called Goldie Health. Goldie Health is in place to it came in place to address the opioid crisis, but ultimately they're also seeing some real hope in identifying and diagnosing potential at-risk patients.
Right.
But when Goldie was first created, the idea around Goldie is it would live in the field and it would be tied to community health workers. But ultimately, what we all know, and none of those community health workers had anything except for Google spreadsheets. I mean, whether you're sitting in an ambulance or you're a community health worker sitting in, a shop, you only have access to those kinds of things.
Right.
And none of it linked back into the hospital, where ultimately they ended up in many cases seeing these patients in an emergency room. And so Goldie Health has had to figure out, how am I linking these disparate systems that are even outside of the hospital system back into the hospital system, and is having great success in doing so.
So that's really interesting how they pivoted and moved forward. And that kind of reminds me of conversations I often have with founders of small companies that are just not getting the traction they need. And they have a solid value proposition, solid product strategy, but they're not getting on the radar of the buyer at the level that they really hope to. And so I always tell them, well, you've got a good strategy, but it's not a great strategy. You've got to go beyond just doing the basics. You've really got to unlock 10 times value.
Correct.
And really, really solve a major issue so that kind of the buyers come to you, if you will. It sounds like Goldie Health, when they went through this process, they kind of pivoted toward that 10 times value place.
Yes.
And what are some other things that you have seen that help companies do that, so that what does it take to really unlock that 10 times value?
Frankly, it takes a vision, a strategy, and the right founders. And I can't underscore, I mean, we have a recruiting team that is so critical to our business, that finds amazing, experienced founders that otherwise wouldn't do this. But I remember when I came to Alloy Partners, I interviewed a founder that we had it was one of our early companies with Elanco. It's called Athian. And I interviewed Jeff, and Jeff had sold his last company to Oracle. And I said, Jeff, why, or I'm sorry, Paul, it wasn't Jeff, it was Paul. Jeff was the co-founder, technology co-founder. And I said to Paul, why did you do this? Like, you could have started any company that you wanted to start. And he said, because I'd always wanted to work in this particular space, solving this problem, and never had the opportunity. You guys came to me with capital already in the bank and a strategy of what you wanted to get to long term, and essentially the first year already figured out. Why would I not do this? And those are usually the people that go to work for private equity firms,
right,
and do turnarounds. And so I can't underscore for you enough how important having John Sheehan join VFlock, because John Sheehan not only understood healthcare systems, he also had previously run a workforce company. And John is planning to change workforce.
Yes.
I mean, he's going in one door tied to staffing, but it longitudinally is a workforce company and is
Got it.
integrating with workforce solutions. And again, kind of the same thing. Chris Martin, when we hired him as the CEO of Goldie Health, Chris actually had lost a family member to the opioid
Mhm.
crisis. Chris was one of those people who was a serial entrepreneur and actually ran from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. on that first race around the opioid crisis. He was so
Right.
passionate
Yes.
about longitudinally doing this. And now I have a current situation where we're starting a company that is AI first in a particular field of healthcare that we've been trying to solve forever. And I have found a founder that is AI first CEO multiple times, consumer and healthcare, and sold to pharma, all
Hmm.
AI solutions, that simply wants to do something more impactful. And the ideas that we came to him with, here's a long-term strategy, here's the short-term plan, what do you think? And he frankly blew my mind based upon how much more extreme he wants to take this
Hmm.
and how we can have an AI first solution to solve this problem that no one in the world is imagining right now.
I love the fact that you mentioned his desire to have a bigger impact. I think you see that so often, and healthcare is such an opportunity for those founders who really, really, really want to make a difference. I mean, obviously, you want to
Yep.
scale, you want to make a nice chunk of change somewhere along the way, but ultimately,
Mhm.
the impact is really get kind of the mission side of it. I think is very, very powerful. And for those of us who've been in this industry for a long time, no, once it gets in your system, it's hard to it's part of your DNA. You can't help yourself. It's not just about the business at hand. So one of the, I'm going to call it a delay tactic for lack of a better word, but one of the delay tactics we see in the industry quite frequently is organizations will say, well, let me do a pilot. And there's this whole pilot-itis concern that they never really intentionally plan to scale, or they don't go into the pilot thinking about how do we move from this one trial to kind of the whole next level. And
Yep.
how do you guys address that, resolve that, or encourage kind of that bigger thinking? When you mention this
Yep.
founder who's coming up with all these great ideas, he may blow way past some of
Yep.
these organizations that are still in that pilot mindset.
Yeah. So realize this is our secret sauce. I mean, Alloy Partners, as we are designing a solution with a partner, we are also talking to them about what is this pilot gonna, before we ever launch a company, what is this
Right.
pilot gonna look like? Is it gonna be paid? Is it not gonna be paid? What are the key metrics for success? How do we move behind pilot? I mean, we're talking, use hospitals. Before we start a company, we've already worked out with them, what's it going to take to get the BAA signed, the MSA signed, and get through procurement. That's
Right.
our job to figure
Right.
that out before we even bring a founder in. When you're a normal baby company, you're going in and figuring out how to secure a pilot. I mean, it's almost impossible for you alone to work high enough in the organization that you can get that understanding of what the KPIs need to look like to succeed.
And
And
you're
so
doing
that's
that
why,
across ventures for their entire portfolio, not just one company.
yes, that's exactly right.
Right.
And so, the company that I'm talking about that we haven't started yet, we're starting with one of our studios. So Alloy Partners as a company also operates a variety of studios. We have one in Arkansas focused on retail supply chain. Our Notre Dame studio is called 1842. It has an operating budget and a fund on the side, and it is predominantly focused on healthcare. And one of the companies that we're launching right now, we already have two healthcare system lined up to
Perfect.
be pilot customers, and we haven't
Perfect.
hired the CEO yet.
Perfect.
And
That's
so,
very interesting.
and if you didn't do that, it would just take forever and too much money. And
You'd
that's
be
why those
stuck in
companies
quicksand.
run out of cash.
You'd be stuck in quicksand all the time. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, I was working with a venture capital guy, and he had this very, very complex technology, and he wanted to sell it into healthcare. Well, we looked at it, and it was obvious it would just not make sense in healthcare at all. And we told him, that there's just a real disconnect here. Long story short, he came back and said, well, maybe you guys just aren't really ready to work in venture. I said, maybe your venture isn't ready to work in healthcare, because what you said, it can just be very sluggish and just take for absolute ever. That's for sure.
Yeah. And you brought up a second ago, who's making decisions in healthcare and why is that different, and point solutions, et cetera. I mean, what we've clearly come to learn, and this is, a sign of the times, is because of ERPs and everything else, the CFO needs a big say in the beginning. If I can get the people who are going to be the implementers to say, this is a solution I want, absolutely, I want to do this, we're ready to implement tomorrow, that is not good enough. If I can't get the CFO to say, we see the ROI as important enough, and ROI isn't just cash to them.
No, it's not. Right.
It's also, what is it going to require my internal resources to implement something like this? And so it's just like if you went to a CFO and said, we want you to rip out Epic and implement something else. I mean, of course that would never happen, but I think people don't understand that there's smaller versions of that same problem. And
Yes.
we as Alloy partners want to get the CFO into, frankly, the early discussion around strategy and the
Right.
gaps and what are the priorities, because if they're not ultimately going to sign off on both the investment and this being, them being a customer of the solution that we're creating, we're running against a wall. And that didn't used to be the case.
Well, and things have just, as the market has had to address so many more challenges, it's, just the dollar is at least what a lot of people lead with. That's for sure. I've written 5 books on return on investment of healthcare data technology. So I've dealt with this topic for quite some time. So what excites you and other members of Alloy about where healthcare as an industry is headed? Any specifics there?
Yeah, well, you recently participated with us in a healthcare summit that we hosted in New York. I am very excited that CEOs and boards have long come to the understanding that they've been throwing bodies at solutions, and we can't scale and effectively support our patients doing that. As you know, you still go to sign up for a surgery and go to 5 different departments, and you're still, even if you're at Stanford or UCSF, you are still filling out paper every single time you turn. And so I think, AI coming at us fast and furious is forcing the envelope. And some companies started as AI first and are scaling already, even in the healthcare space.
Yes.
We know a couple of pharmaceutical companies that you heard from
Right.
that shall remain nameless, that the board was intent on AI from the very beginning of the company so that they don't just continue to throw bodies at it. And I think it's hit boards in a really hard way, that they have to reinvent themselves, and their choices are, you either do it now or you're going to be disrupted and
Right.
maybe out of business later.
Right. Right. So on that note, if you became aware of a health system that had never done anything, or another company in the healthcare ecosystem or health ecosystem that they're still in that operation mode, what would be the very, very first step that their leadership should consider? What should they do internally before they would even begin to go down that journey with you guys or with someone similar? I mean, what do they need to think about in terms of how innovation will change them?
Yeah. Well, I do think an easy thing, any board, and I'm going to say easy. I know it's not really easy, but any board should be able to do is you can look at your company, just use the great example of the pharmaceutical industry. You can look at your company as a pharma company and say, where do we spend the most money? And the answer is clinical trials in the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
And so based upon that, where do we have a repeatable business that we kind of think that we have a playbook around? Clinical trials. We've been doing them for hundreds of years, or creating medical reports or outcomes. Those are the places that could be most naturally thought about to bring AI in and to address them. And the conflict, whether you're a pharma company or a healthcare company, the conflict comes in place when you start thinking about implementing a solution. Because if I'm in healthcare and what I want to address are some processes, maybe my most expensive place of business in the hospital system is my emergency room, and you work with a company like ours to address what are the gaps there, what actually are major changes that we think that we could make from an ROI standpoint and a patient outcome standpoint. We then want to go and implement it, and bam, we immediately run into, but we've got to address patient care every single day.
Yeah.
I mean, you heard this in New York from pharma companies. I want to do AI trials. I want to implement AI, but I have to run a clinical trial, and I lose, $1 million every day that I delay. That's big money.
I'm so busy in the hamster wheel of doing.
Correct.
I don't have time to stand back and say, kind of that generative thinking, what if and what could be possible. That's really what you're sharing.
Yeah. And so you essentially, I think that's why it does come down to boards and leadership teams, because that can't come from the middle of the organization.
No.
Somebody's saying, oh, gee, I want to go, solve this problem.
Well, that's back to that answer always being no, because they're too busy running in that wheel. Yes.
Right. And that's what they're going to say. And unless a leadership, especially if you're going to do experiments, unless a leadership team is going to say, I realize I'm going to have to allocate short-term resources to implement something new, but I need to know exactly. That's why when we're working with our partners, we can tell them, here's exactly what this is going to take to implement this. This is how long it's going to take to run this pilot. Here's what we're going to know at the end of the pilot. And that's how we're going to be able to roll off resources later. If you don't do that, you're going to be stuck.
And you won't be successful. And I think it's not just stuck. It's like you will fail. You
will fail.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's the same thing relative to looking at AI. You can decide, I can't do this. It's too hard. And you can decide that for the next 5 years when you're out of business.
Well, and let's dig into AI just a bit more, because I do think for those that don't really have the data background or even, I mean, AI has been around for a while. We're just moving into whole new levels and forms of it, but that don't have that understanding. There's a lot of fear out there. Have you been able to, with your partners, separate the type of AI that they should be working with today and why it's safe to do that, as opposed to the risk-driven AI that they may be fearful of, and help them understand the difference.
Yeah. Well, essentially, the way to address the fear is to get the right people to participate in a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're using AI, you essentially are testing something against a baseline
Mm-hmm.
to see how accurate it is. I mean, that's
Right.
what you're doing as part of your pilot. And so you may have to run 1, 2, or 3 cycles to get to 99 or 100% accuracy, but they need to participate in that process and judge when you get to that accuracy that was the accuracy you had. Maybe you didn't even have it at that level, but you thought you did by having 5 people work on it.
And it gives them the ability, seeing how that's run, to trust and
Correct.
recognize that it's not going to be, run amok and take them on a journey they're not prepared to go on. So
Yeah. I mean, we have to think about the fact that millions of us log into Netflix, where Netflix are taking our personal data.
Yes,
They are tracking every single thing we do on Netflix, and then they are feeding us stuff. Same thing happens on your phone. And so
absolutely.
why you cannot have a chat bot that introduces you before you ever arrive at the hospital. I mean, I'm just thinking in broadest possible construct, why you have people making phone calls
You're
when
right.
you could, and you could do it in multiple languages. You could do it. I mean, a chatbot is different than the person on your phone saying, push A if you want to do this, push B. That is not what a chatbot is. I mean, a chatbot is going to learn from your questions and you're going to train it for a long period of time. But why you wouldn't do that to get somebody enrolled in coming into the hospital door and figure out what their transportation issues are, figure out what all of the other issues are before they get there, is just beyond me.
And I'm going to use health systems for an example, but they spend hours, years, if you will, of leadership time worrying about how many full-time equivalents are dedicated to a function. And in reality, so many of those functions could be replaced, or at a minimum augmented now with the tools that we have, whether it be AI driven or some type of process automation. I mean, there are just so many ways, instead of worrying, are we putting 1 FTE here or half an FTE there or 2 FTEs in another? I mean, it is hours and hours and hours of leadership time on that. And I think that's going to be a big opportunity to reduce the cost of care.
Yeah. And hours of non-patient time for nurses and nurse managers.
Absolutely. Whether that be them, staffing, like BFlock helps, or other functions, dealing with the supplies or dealing with the families. I mean, there are just so many opportunities.
Yeah.
So we're getting kind of close to the end of our time together. So I'd like to kind of do a rapid fire close and ask you a few questions, and and then we'll wrap it up. But so, what is the one myth about innovation in healthcare that you wish leaders would let go of?
I mean, the biggest myth is that someone is in charge of innovation.
That's fair.
Because, the board and the leadership team all equally need to be committed to looking for disruptive opportunities in their business, like looking for, not analyzing, but looking for disruptive opportunities to, improve patient care, et cetera. That is the number one myth, that you could give someone a job and their sole job is to do that for an entire company.
Well, it's the same thing with like the vice president of patient engagement. It's like that one individual is going to engage all the patients and And in some organizations, I've learned it's basically the person that reviews the surveys and the complaints, and that's about it. But there's a real opportunity to push these concepts and thoughts throughout the whole culture, not just have a title with a leader who's in charge of it. What about, we mentioned Clayton Christensen earlier, but are there any other kind of current day podcast leaders or books or thinkers that really kind of drive you personally, or that are having an impact at Alloy?
Yeah. Well, obviously our number one, and I don't know if you can see me, but our number one is Elliot's book.
Right.
That is tied to all of the lessons that he's had, both working with Clayton Christensen and then working with our customers. It's called The Illusion of Innovation.
I have it right here.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Because I mean, you can go through that to understand and hear the experiences that we've had working with boards, C-suites, and innovation leaders that are trying their best to be that one person or that team of people. But in many cases, the subtext of Elliot's book is that, many of us are running innovation theater, whereas we talk about innovation and nothing ever changes or gets implemented.
I see it all the time. It's the buzzword, we're going to innovate. And yes, for sure.
Yeah. I learned mostly from founders and new technologies. And so I listened to everything from how I built that to on NPR to the crazy guys at the All In podcast, and pretty much everything tied to founders telling their stories of, their journeys, because that's what we have to live every day. We could do work with our partners to solve problems and talk about solutions, but until we can actually implement with them, and until we can help our founders weave through to a future state strategy, we haven't solved anything.
I got it. So I always ask the same question of every guest I have, because I know we've missed something. So what is the one thing we should have talked about today that we haven't touched on?
I do think if healthcare leaders are listening to this, it's how they engage their board. Because I do think boards are a key to helping create cover for implementing new innovation. And frankly, I think one of the things that has to happen more than anything is we need to start selecting board members that have experience with disruptive innovation and implementing that, whether that's, CEOs that were former founders or other. Because it's really, really hard if you're a C-suite and you have no one above you that understands the road that you're going down. I mean, I found it amazing recently that the Novo Nordisk CEO was removed. I mean, this is, one of the other GLP-1 companies in the world. And one assumes that they are swimming in revenue, but I'm guessing their swimming in revenue wasn't exactly what the board wanted. It's just fascinating to me. And I think it's a hallmark that all of our C-suites should be aware of, is if you don't have somebody like that, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do.
And they need to challenge you and keep you on your toes, because business as usual is not the future, for sure.
Yeah, they need to be pushing you.
Yes. Well, thank you. I have so enjoyed our conversation today, Lesa. It's been informative. I've enjoyed working with you guys, but this is just taking it to a whole new level. So I appreciate it so much. And
Great.
I hope
Thank you for
listeners
having
will
us.
too. Well, great.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.